Shakespeare appreciation is coming back into fashion, and it's happened relatively recently. It was only perhaps 6 to 12 months ago that I noticed, or at least I remarked to myself and to others, that nobody's interested in Shakespeare. I was quite saddened by this, but indeed, just because you climb a mountain alone does not diminish the view you get at the summit. It doesn't really matter if no one accompanies you on your journey, but at the same time, isn't it so much better to climb that mountain, look out across the distance, and have a companion, a friend, a close loved one, or many loved ones at your side so that you can all look to one another and say, wow, in unison. But things are changing, and I've noticed a renewed interest for William Shakespeare, the works of William Shakespeare, both his sonnets and his plays. So I would like to talk a little bit off the cuff with just some thoughts and meditations on reading Shakespeare and appreciating him, and maybe you might be able to glean a little bit of advice from an ardent fan of his work. Now, the first thing I want to say, let's get one of the controversial points out of the way, is you very much can read the works of Shakespeare. You do not have to see them or listen to them. You do not have to go to a theatre. You do not have to watch a film version or a TV adaptation. You do not have to listen to an audiobook. Some people, my past self included, will try to convince you that's the best way to see the plays. I no longer subscribe to this belief, and I have a few reasons for changing my mind. The first reason is based upon the fact that Shakespeare very much did write for readers as well as theatre goers. As you may know, Shakespeare was wildly successful in his own time, but he had a reading public. Many people will say, you're not supposed to read the plays, they're meant to be seen, and this is true. They are visual, and they are performative, and they do lend themselves to good actors. But at the same time, Shakespeare was writing very much conscious of those who would put the productions on in the theatre of their mind. And I must say that the theatre of your mind, if you summon all your imaginative powers, all the powers of imagination, to set the scene and cast the characters and clothe them and give their voices a certain timbre, a certain lilt, a certain sway, yourself, you have your own auditorium in your mind. You see the stage in your mind, in the quiet and solitude of your mind. This actually is vastly superior to what anybody can put on stage. Now, there have been some wonderful productions of Shakespeare. I look back with great fondness at the old Vic production of King Lear with Pete Postlethwaite. He was a very old man at the time. He was perfectly suited for Lear, and King Lear, along with Hamlet, is one of those plays that is deemed unperformable. Indeed, it's better to read King Lear in a period of quiet and contemplation so you can really summon the energy. It cannot be fully performed on stage, and Hamlet is the same. But many people forget that Shakespeare himself was faced with the problem of how to perform his own plays. He did perform them, he even acted in them. He played Hamlet's father's ghost in the first productions, with Richard Burbage playing Hamlet. Shakespeare most likely would have isolated and chose one aspect of the play to pivot into, to emphasise, and would have left the rest to his readers' powers of imagination, because Hamlet, by all objective measures, was somewhat of a bestseller in its day. That production of King Lear energised me for weeks. I couldn't stop thinking about it, I couldn't stop talking about it. I was like a child again, so much excitement as I came out of the theatre. They did a really good job. It was powerful. The storm on the heath scene was incredible. I was in the splash zone, I got drenched, and it was brutal. They really did a tremendous job giving full expression to the pagan poetry of King Lear. I remember the first play I saw was Hamlet at Stratford-upon-Avon, and I remember the soliloquising Dane standing out to me. But when I go to a play of Shakespeare, more often than not, I leave the theatre disappointed. Very often I've left during the intermission. I don't know what it is, but most productions of Shakespeare challenge themselves to be as experimental as possible, or to be as ideologically driven as possible, and they get really far away from a Shakespearean reading, production and performance of the work. If you find yourself cringing at Shakespeare and thinking, okay, I have to reconcile that, I suppose Shakespeare is just a bit cringe. It's not. Shakespeare is not cringe. If you find yourself cringing or not being able to abide certain performances, the problem is with the performance. It's not with you. It's not because you're failing to appreciate anything. It's because Shakespeare is horrendously difficult to perform. No wonder Tolstoy damned Shakespeare. Did he ever see a good performance of the work? Most likely not. So I really want to implore you to slow down, have some quiet, have a space, treat it like meditation, really unpick the language, appreciate it, say it out loud if you want. So really try to understand what's going on, really try and see what's before you when you're reading it. And I would invite you to try a really quite immersive reading experience, which I think is perfect for Shakespeare. I call it the 3 reads method. Though indeed I think lovers of literature should read Shakespeare endlessly. They should be always reading him. He should be always running in the background of their reading adventure. But when you come to a Shakespeare play for the first time, try the 3 reads method. Basically, read the play, go search out a performance. So you might want to listen to a performance, you might want to actually go see one, and then read it again. Aloud, if possible. That sounds like a lot of work, but by the time you get to the end of that experience, you're going to have such a relish and appreciation for the work. You're going to understand how the characters work, their motivations. You're going to understand the themes and preoccupations of the universe Shakespeare is creating. And it's going to help inform your reading of anything else, because indeed we are all influenced, as Harold Bloom would contend, by Shakespeare. Now you might have noticed that I keep hammering home this idea of reading aloud. Why do I keep doing that? Well, one reason is based purely on the fact that the best performances of Shakespeare have been the readings that I have done aloud in private. I remember struggling to abide his early immature Henriad cycle, the Henry VI part 1, 2 and 3, and indeed if you try a chronological reading of Shakespeare, you could be forgiven for giving up and abandoning the project, because these are not good plays. You have to wait a little bit before his masterpiece phase settles in. But I really had those plays come alive by virtue of my friend at university, who was a bit of a history buff. We performed these plays together. We divvied up the roles and we read them aloud, and we actually put quite a bit of effort into it. And those performances that I did in my own private space, in which I formed more of a deep bond and connection with my friend, those are the best performances of the play that I know of, honest to God. So read the plays aloud. Another thing that I've noticed in this trend of increased appreciation for Shakespeare is just how many non-native English speakers are coming to Shakespeare. The funny thing about Shakespeare, or the genius thing, the sublime thing, the mesmerising thing about the bard, is just how much is communicated even when you don't have complete access to all the language. Indeed, even native speakers working today have a lot that's cut off from their understanding because the language is quite archaic. We know that. But I speak to Russian people, I speak to Spanish people, I speak to Chinese people, I speak to people from all over the world, German people, Italian people, and they want to read, relish and appreciate Shakespeare, but they do not do so in translation. And I applaud them. That there is nothing that I know that's going to supercharge your road to fluency than wrestling with one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult, poets in the English language. You're reading above your head, indeed we always are, no matter who you are, whether you're an academic, whether you're a man or woman of great accomplishment or not. Shakespeare is always just above our heads and we're trying to catch up with him. Shakespeare is above my head, so that's why endless reading of him makes me grow. We grow when we challenge ourselves. So if you feel a challenge with Shakespeare, what you're actually feeling is growth, intellectual growth, empathetic growth, and spiritual growth. Now, another thing that's worth mentioning is that we shouldn't try to condescend to Shakespeare. We shouldn't patronise him. We shouldn't dupe ourselves into thinking that we know more than him, or he has a blind spot that we're aware of and he isn't. I believe this fashion, though this might be optimistic, is dying out. But for a very long time, readings of Shakespeare, academic readings, wouldn't start from a position of love, and indeed, though I recommend the Arden editions of Shakespeare because they have great introductions and great notes, I noticed that with every edition, every renewed edition, first, second, third, the introductions would become more infused with a subtle discrimination against Shakespeare, a subtle scorning. In my time in Oxford, I really questioned whether these academics loved Shakespeare. Indeed, I don't think they did. I don't know whether it was down to jealousy or just an inability to wrangle with some of the themes of the human condition that Shakespeare does so artfully. Shakespeare was everybody and nobody, as Borges said, in a time where his peers, his playwright peers like Marlowe and Kidd, were being murdered by the Elizabethan Secret Service. A time in which marrying oneself and martyring oneself to strong political or religious affiliation would be a foolish thing to do and a dangerous thing to do. Lawyers read Shakespeare and they say he was a lawyer. Doctors read Shakespeare and say he was a doctor. Seafarers read Shakespeare and say he must have been a man of the sea. You most certainly can read Shakespeare in a Freudian sense, although Freud learned everything he knew about the human condition from Shakespeare. You can read Shakespeare as an environmentalist. You can read him through colonialist theory. You can read him through whatever prism you wish, but you're always going to come up short and you're always going to do him, ultimately, a disservice because you cannot peg him, you cannot confine him, you cannot box him. He is everybody and nobody simultaneously. We come to Shakespeare primarily with deference and a love of literature. Anywho, let me show you 3 potential editions that you may wish to pursue in your reading of Shakespeare. Now, the first is an edition that I have spoken about at length, and it is the Arden edition. Though I did say something a little bit scornful just a moment ago, this edition really is quite good. It tells you everything you need to know about the history. I'm particularly interested in the performance of the history. What did the first performance of King Lear look like? Where did it go from there? Why did they change the ending? All this sort of thing. It deals with all of that. And if you ever find yourself running into trouble with the words Shakespeare uses, then it has a great section for annotations. So the Arden edition, they're very collectible as well. They look really nice on your shelf if you find you're making your way through the complete works of Shakespeare rather than getting one of those huge, cumbersome and unfortunately rather inadequate complete works of Shakespeare. Go and get the individual plays if you can afford it. And I got this great idea from a book club reader who is making his way through the Shakespeare plays as well. He has a shelf with the Ardens, and he has one stack that is his read shelf, and then he has another stack that's a pile of his to be read, in order of which he's going to come to them. I can think of nothing more motivating and exciting than seeing where you've come from in regards to your Shakespeare reading, and then seeing where you're going. So you know, oh, I've got the Henry IV Part 1 and 2 coming up. Oh, now I've got Much Ado About Nothing. You know what's on the horizon, and it's something to be said for being visual about your reading and actually having the work in question. So you can go for the Ardens. I quite like them. I really like, however, and this is my favourite at the moment, I love the Everyman collection. As you can see here, this is a collection of tragedies volume 1, and it has Hamlet, it has Othello, it has King Lear. I don't believe it has Antony and Cleopatra, but it does have Macbeth. And the paper quality is beautiful, and these editions always come with a really thoughtful introduction by someone who clearly loves the bard as well, and it comes with a chronology. It's beautiful. It's a really beautiful thing to hold in your hands, and you can really feel the poetry, and you can spend some time in solitude relishing the words on the page. And what's really good about this, though, this is like removing the training wheels. There's not tons of notes, there's not tons of annotations, and there's not tons of explanations. You're somewhat on your own. Now, they do put down a couple of key things that might trip people up, but it's not exhaustive. I think that's a good thing. Anybody who's learnt a second language knows that you can work a lot out from context, and that's actually better than fretting over each and every individual word. You might want to ration yourself and only look up 3 or 4 different words per page, and just try and figure out the rest on your own. You might want to consult performances or listen to performances to help you, but we're smarter than we give ourselves credit for. So don't be too alarmed at taking off the training wheels. I think it's a good thing. And indeed, you could also just go for a cheap, cost-effective paperback like this Penguin one. It's very slim. You can stuff it in your pocket. It also doesn't have exhaustive notes, which I think's good. It's good for dog-earing, scribbling all over and making notes all over. So those are 3 options for editions for you. My next word of advice is to pick the order that's right for you. Now, someone who has already read the great plays by Shakespeare before or is somewhat acquainted with them, someone who wants to do a real deep dive into the bard, may wish to do a chronological reading. You could read 1 play per week in chronological order, and you will have finished Shakespeare's oeuvre within a year, which is remarkable, really. You could read more than 1 per week. Indeed, if you're looking for a really intense reading experience, you can read the play in an evening or across several evenings. And there is something to be said with distilling or compressing how much Shakespeare you read in a short time frame. Now, there's something also obviously to be said for a little and often approach, like a sonnet reading experience, a sonnet adventure where you read one every now and then and you go through and you let it live alongside your life and you let it bleed into your other literature, whatever else you're appreciating. Proust is a good pairing with the sonnets. I've spent the last few nights reading Hamlet, King Lear, Macbeth, Othello and Antony and Cleopatra back to back, and it is an alarming experience. And indeed, there was a year, and James Shapiro calls it the Year of Lear, 1605, in which Shakespeare would have penned King Lear, and he would have penned Macbeth and Antony and Cleopatra. So if you want to get a sense of what that would have been like to compose them in such a short time frame, read them in a short time frame as well. Now, reading chronologically is great for somebody who wants to get a deep appreciation of the rise of Shakespeare and his career as a dramatist, but there's a few problems. The first problem is everybody has different conceptions of the chronology. If you'd like my opinion, we can do a video of it, just let me know. We'll talk about the chronology of Shakespeare, but it's contested. I can give you my educated guess, but it doesn't mean that I'm right. I'm definitely right on a few of them, but definitely some of those earlier plays, there's a lot of interchangeability, so we don't quite know the chronology. There's a bit of guesswork, a bit of art going into trying to ascertain any sort of order. Secondly, if you're reading chronologically, Shakespeare did some shit plays, and they're not fun. Now, we could have some fun with Titus Andronicus, for example, but it's not a good play. It's a banquet of blood, but not in a good way. Not in a Hamlet or King Lear sense. To be honest, even though Shakespeare was really good at comedies early on, with plays like The Taming of the Shrew, Comedy of Errors, Two Gentlemen of Verona, it wasn't really until he hit his late immature or early mature period with Romeo and Juliet and A Midsummer Night's Dream. A Midsummer Night's Dream being his first perfect play, his first masterpiece, I would say. So if you're reading chronologically, you have to wade through a lot of stuff that's not that fun. But there is some good ones as well. Richard III is an early play, and I personally like it. There's a lot of poetry there. There is a little bit of psychological complexity peeking through. You could also just simply read the best ones first. Now, what are the best ones? You might ask someone who knows Shakespeare and has studied Shakespeare a lot. You might want to ask them what they think and then go through it that way. That's good. But if you read some of the lesser known ones first, or do a chronological reading, you have even more of an intense appreciation for his masterpieces than you would if you just read them straight away. Now, there is another order you can go in that I haven't recommended anywhere that is going to be the foundation for our Shakespeare reading project in the new year with the Hardcore Literature Book Club. I'm not going to reveal it just yet, but I've not spoken about it anywhere, and I think this might be the perfect order. It's particularly perfect for people who are relative newcomers to Shakespeare and want to become acquainted with him and excited about him very, very rapidly, but it's also perfect for those who've read Shakespeare before. I'm not going to say too much else because I want to keep this as a little surprise, so we're going to keep the secret for a little bit longer, and then I'm going to reveal my book club order for the plays that we'll be reading. Now, another piece of advice, if I could give to those who want to get better acquainted with Shakespeare, is this idea that locating the man himself is somewhat of a fool's errand. I've already hit upon this idea that Shakespeare is everybody and nobody, and we can't pin him down. Now, ascertaining who the man was and doing a biographical reading might be a fool's errand, and even if we know something of the writers, biographical readings very often harm rather than help the text. There are a few exceptions, Cervantes and Proust being I personally believe they're exceptions. You may not be able to find Shakespeare the man, but you will find something of yourself. And everybody always gets something a little bit different out of each and every play. It's almost like a Rorschach test. The sonnets most definitely are. They're a mirror that reflect back at you, but so are the plays, particularly the controversial plays, particularly the difficult plays. So feel free to search for yourself in Shakespeare. Many people treat Shakespeare as scripture. I know I certainly do, because he's more informative than any other text that I know about my nature, human nature, and the world. It's also not much of a fool's errand to go searching for the influence that he's had. He influenced everybody, and as you read through, you'll be able to locate different people, different writers that you love, and that's a really pleasant surprise. It's like you're finding old friends in a text that preceded them. That's always fun. And so a knowledge of Shakespeare increases your knowledge of every other writer you will go on to appreciate. You might also want to give yourself exercises and assignments in order to sharpen your critical and aesthetic appreciation faculties. Rank them as you go through. I did this when I did a chronological reread of all of his plays in the Arden edition. When I got to the end, I would go to the title page and I would put a grade. A plus, B, B minus, D. And then when you get to the end of the plays, you can order them, you can rank them. And for each individual play, give them a grade and a ranking on different areas. What's the characterization like? What's the pacing like? What are the themes of the play like? Do they speak to you? What's the play about? Objectively, and what's it about to you? What's the secret meaning? What's the language like? Many of Shakespeare's plays, as we well know, are an explosion of beautiful language. I would also invite you to collect things along the way. Collect characters that you like. Very often we connect to a play, not because of what it's about, but because of the character who feels more real than life. Hamlet, Cleopatra, Iago, Lear, these are characters that we fall in love with. Rosalind, Juliet, we fall in love with these characters. You might have noticed that I said a few female names. Shakespeare writes women tremendously well. He does have many great parts for men, but he cherished his women, and one might say he favoured them. He gives very strong ideas, very strong displays of wit and language and philosophy to his women characters. It's beautiful. And while we're on the topic, Hamlet, for example, the role that changes significantly with every rendering. When you see a new version of Hamlet, you're wondering what that Hamlet's going to be like. Oh, what is Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet like? How is it different from John Gielgud's Hamlet? How is it different from Laurence Olivier's Hamlet? There is a tradition that they plug into, and every Hamlet tries to do it different. It's a perfect role, and Hamlet could very easily be played by a woman. Whilst we're on the topic as well, I think personally that too many people play Hamlet straight. He's a deep ironist, he's a tremendous humorist, and that to be or not to be scene, one of many examples of tremendous soliloquies, could be played with a bit of joviality. And here's another thing, King Lear. People play King Lear in a humorous way. They should play him straight. It's a devastating play about senility, senility before wisdom. Play Hamlet with irony, play King Lear straight. Or whatever conception, but think about how the characters might play them as you're reading them through in the theatre of your mind. But I would invite you to collect characters, meet them and befriend them. Falstaff, what a great character. Collect soliloquies and monologues, collect phrases, collect proverbs, collect words that you like, mark them, cut them out and keep them, carry them around with you, memorise them, inhale them, live them. And finally, talk about Shakespeare. In any capacity that you can. Talk about Shakespeare with your friends, family, and loved ones. And if you don't have anybody who wants to talk about Shakespeare, though of course you can talk about him without actually mentioning him, because his themes can bleed through into your lived experience, your everyday life. If you have no one that wants to talk about Shakespeare, then we have a great group at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. It's at patreon.com/hardcore literature. Check it out. If you love great bookish chats, you're in fine company. We're currently reading Don Quixote. We've read Anna Karenina together. We've read Jane Austen's Persuasion. We've read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. And all of these video lectures, long-form video lectures about the great books, are available for you to self-pace and access anytime you want as an enrolled member of the book club. You'll be warmly welcome. And though we have read a handful of Shakespeare's sonnets so far, we're only just getting started, and we have a tremendous treat for any lover of Shakespeare, any intrepid explorer, anyone who wants to venture into Shakespeare's world for the first time or the 100th time. In the new year, we're going to have some very cool stuff in regards to Shakespeare and much else. Thank you very much for watching this video today. If you love Shakespeare as much as me, please leave a comment. And if you've enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe, because that's the easiest and quickest way to tell me to keep making more content. Thank you very much for listening. Happy reading. Have a great day.